Hello there, my RPG lovers, and welcome to another video. Well, it's been almost 2 months since the last episode in this series.
You must be out of your mind!
If this is your first time watching, this is a series of videos where I cover some forgotten games, which I personally find interesting and when a lot of people suggest them in the comments. So if you played some games that people forgot about, be sure to let me know in the comments and I might cover it in one of the future episodes. Anyway, welcome to another episode of Hidden Gems or Trash. Hope you enjoy. Number 5. Mage Knight Apocalypse. Mage Knight Apocalypse is an action RPG that came out exclusively on PC back in 2006. You won't be able to buy this game today because it's not on Steam or any other online platform. So if you're really curious to try it out, well, get your pirate hat ready. But let me stop you right there because trust me when I say that it's not worth the hustle.
What? How is that possible?
I barely got this game to work on Windows 10, and even when I finally got it running, I have to wait at least a couple of minutes before the game actually starts. I wouldn't mind those issues that much if the game was actually worth playing, but it's not. Not to mention that you won't be able to run it with modern resolutions like Full HD or 4K. This is how you get to see the game in the video, and this is how I got to play it. I was always curious about this game and I finally got to try it out. To tell you the truth, I wish I stayed curious because the game is pretty bad.
Curse those little maggots.
I remember watching some gameplay videos about it and it looked kinda fun. I mean, it looks pretty outdated, even by 2006 standards, but the gameplay looks like something I could enjoy, since I played a lot of similar RPGs from this time period. Well, I was completely wrong. The gameplay has a lot of issues, but let's start with the visuals. Like I said, Mage Knight Apocalypse looks very outdated, even for 2006 standards. Mage Knight has some MMORPG vibes when it comes to the visuals. This is not the only single-player RPG from that time period with an MMO vibe. World of Warcraft had a huge impact on games in general back then, so it's not surprising at all. Mage Knight looks like a generic fantasy RPG with some steampunk elements, mainly from the dwarves. For some odd reason the game is locked on 30 FPS, but even that didn't bother me a lot. When it comes to the story, Mage Knight has a very simple premise. This game has your typical fantasy races which are at war. The group of spirit masters fear that the world will come to an end if the war is not stopped. You need to recover 5 aspects of the apocalypse which are scattered throughout the world. In the beginning of the game you need to help some dwarves and their main city looks heavily inspired by Ironforge from WoW. The WoW comparison doesn't stop there though. Anyway, there are a bunch of in-game cutscenes and scripted linear events which will trigger at certain story points. I don't think these cutscenes are awful, even though their presentation is not all that great. The voice acting is okay-ish. I certainly heard a lot worse, and it seems like every dialogue line is voice acted in the game, so that's something, right?
By the command of King Breck!
The dialogue and characters are pretty basic, and it quickly gets really boring to listen to these NPCs. They have a lot of dialogue lines, or at least it seems so, because it quickly gets boring. That's another thing I would be ready to tolerate if the gameplay was fun, so let's talk about that. The biggest problem with the gameplay in Mage Knight is on the fundamental level. This game suffers from an identity crisis. It just can't decide if it wants to be a third-person action RPG or an isometric point-and-click. Listen, I'm not complaining about multiple options to control your character, but if none of those options feel good, you got a big problem on your hands.
How is that possible?
I honestly can't decide which is the worst way to play the game, but since I personally prefer a third-person view with WASD movement, I naturally opted for that playstyle. No matter what you choose, you'll be forced to click on enemies a lot, which could be a bit easier with the isometric view. However, the controls are very clunky in general, so it doesn't feel good in either camera perspective. It's like the game has an input lag, because it never feels instant and you have to keep clicking on the enemy. I think auto attack would fix some of the gameplay issues, but that's only the first step that we have to make in order to improve the combat. Then we have the abilities which can be casted with different numbers, but they feel clunky as well. You can choose between 5 different characters with just a few customization options. I went with the Amazon Chella because her skills look the most interesting to me. The graphics are not the only thing which were inspired by the famous MMO. The inventory and even the progression system works very similar to WoW. Each character gets 3 different skill trees with unique abilities. The Amazon has ranged and melee abilities, but you don't get to select them manually like you would probably expect. Instead, your skills and stats will improve upon use. It's something similar to Skyrim, for example. That would be completely fine if not for the extremely unsatisfying controls, which make the combat way worse than it should be. Not to mention the brain-dead AI and pretty bad animations and sound effects. For some stupid reason I played on hard and I did die more than a couple of times. The placement of the respawn points can be really bad, because the enemies can instantly attack you as soon as you revive. You don't get your full health upon reviving, God knows why, and if you're out of health pots, you're screwed. I did have some fun with the loot in the game, and once again it's very similar to WoW. It seems like the loot is totally randomized, you can find high quality items by pure luck. But your inventory bag is extremely limited, which gets frustrating after only 20 minutes of gameplay. There is a stash that you can use, and I assume you can transfer items from other characters as well, although I'm not sure. I didn't care enough to check, to be honest. The maps have tight corridors and exploration is very linear, so I don't have a lot of things to say about that. Wow, this sounds like the worst game ever, right? Well, no, I played a lot worse, but it's definitely up there. If they fix the problems with unresponsive controls and make them a bit snappier, I will probably even finish the game. Here's the thing, even though the game is bad, it really seems like these developers tried their best. I got the feeling like they tried really hard to make a fun game, but they just failed completely when it comes to the gameplay. I wouldn't recommend trying this game out today, but hey, I can't stop you if that's what you wish to do.
Most of those sons of hill goats ran up the mountain, carrying off everyone else to turn over to the slavers, no doubt. But I will burn before I wear those chains again.
Number 4. Ascent Reborn. Ascent Reborn first came out on Xbox 360 in 2013 and on PC in 2014. Back then, the game was called Ascent Hand of Kult and it was described as an action MMORPG. While this game had some online features, of which some of them are pretty cool actually, it's far from being an actual MMORPG. That's like claiming that Dark Souls games are MMORPGs because they have invade and co-op features. Speaking of which, Ascent Reborn online features are very similar to Dark Souls Invasions, but we'll get to that soon. This game had a very short running time when it first released. The servers were shut down in 2014 on Xbox and the servers on PC suffered from the same fate in 2016. Out of nowhere, the game released on Steam in 2022 with a new name, and that's the version that I've been playing. This is a free-to-play game, by the way, so if you're curious to try it out, you don't have any barriers to entry. The story is almost non-existing in this game. There is only one short cutscene in the beginning, but you will find a lot of dialogue scenarios while progressing through the game. The dialogue is not voice acted, by the way, but that's not an issue because it's usually very short. You play as a warrior race called... I'm pretty sure that's not pronounced as Chaos, but whatever. Chaos, I guess? Your main goal in the game is to worship one of 3 gods and destroy the titans, that's pretty much it. And if you want to learn more, there are some lore stones you're going to find, but the story is like, whatever. The beginning of the game was really weird at first, but it makes more sense once you start playing the game. You get 50k souls to spend on various customization options and to buy some gear. Then you enter this pretty cool hub area where you get to choose between 3 different gods. These are actually other players on the leaderboards with the high score. I think that's pretty cool actually. You have to pledge allegiance to one of the gods and fight under their banner. Darkness, Light or the Void, those are your options, and I went with the Void because it sounds and it looks cool. These gods offer you different spells that you can use, and some of the items can be only equipped while you're worshipping a certain god. This is where those multiplayer features come into play. Every once in a while you get the option to defend these areas. This was a little bit sus because it happened a bit too often, up to the point where I started to doubt that these are real players. According to SteamDB, there are less than 10 players who play this game on a daily basis, so I don't know. They move like real players would, although I hadn't lost a single fight, which is also a little bit sus. Besides the invading feature, you can also see phantoms and check the overall score on these maps as well as the leaderboards I mentioned before. I really like to see some light online features in single player RPGs because it makes them a bit more fun to play. So what about the gameplay? Well, it's a mixed bag overall. It plays like a hack and slash third person RPG for the most part. My biggest issue is the clunky controls. Moving your character around feels like driving a car sometimes. However, the attacks and spells are decent overall once you get the hang of it. The melee combat has different combos that you can use, but I only used a couple of combinations. Performing longer combos is definitely useful because you usually do a lot more damage, but it can be hard to pull off. You have light and heavy hits, a dash button and a block. All of those abilities are useful in fights. However, the game suffers from some very bad hitboxes and the lack of enemy types. After almost 10 hours of gameplay, I was still fighting a couple of enemy types that you get to fight in the first hour of gameplay. The game reuses a lot of the same boss fights on different maps, which can make some dungeons unnecessarily long and tedious. The maps are pretty linear, but you always have some optional dungeons which are worth doing because of the loot. There are some cool mechanics, like being able to call upon a bunch of humans to climb on you. They will attack enemies with you, you can heal by eating one of them or throw them on enemies. It's not a big deal, but it's kinda cool. Loot is everything in this game, and I don't like how the progression works, even though you'll get some very cool looking armors and weapons. First of all, the menu is laggy as all hell, there is always a delay when you press buttons. There is an in-game store which will replenish each time you level up, so you can buy new items, but you can also find items in chests. This game is free to play, like I said, but it's also pay to win, because you can buy souls with real money. Yeah, that sucks, but who cares? No one is playing this game anyway. You can definitely buy items through regular means by just playing the game and collecting souls. Although you will hit a brick wall, which means that you have to grind a little bit and collect enough souls for upgrades and new items. Of course you will. In a way, this game feels pretty unique with some of its features. I wouldn't mind to see some similar features in other single-player RPGs, where the main goal is to conquer and protect your territories. I mean, sure, the PvP would probably be unbalanced as all hell, but who cares? People are having a blast with Elden Ring and Souls games. Mountain Blade Bannerlord comes to mind. Imagine if you had to defend some of the cities or villages from real players when they invade the world. But that's just me and my random thoughts about this topic. Ultimately, Ascend Reborn is a clunky hack and slash pay to win garbage with a few cool ideas. You can try it out if you're curious, because it's free, but I would not recommend playing it in general. Number 3. Kult Heretic Kingdoms. Kult Heretic Kingdoms, or Heretic Kingdoms The Inquisition, is an isometric action RPG originally released in 2004. Yeah, the game had two different names, one for North America and one for the rest of the world, I guess. If you watched the 6th episode of Hidden Gems or Trash, you might remember me covering Shadows Awakening RPG. Well, that game was technically a sequel to Heretic Kingdoms. However, you might get confused by Shadows Heretic Kingdoms, which came out in 2014. That was basically the same game like Shadows Awakening, but it was not feature complete, it was only 1/3 of the game. I'm not trying to get you confused, but the whole publishing situation with these games is kinda messy. All you need to know is that Shadows Awakening was the full-blown sequel to Heretic Kingdoms, and a very underrated isometric action RPG with some unique features. You can find some of those unique features in Kult Heretic Kingdoms as well. Ever since I played Shadows Awakening, I really wanted to go back and see where it all started. I'm kinda glad I did, but to tell you the truth, this game didn't age all that well, and I'm not talking about the visuals. In fact, I actually like the art style a lot, and there are plenty of interesting things to see while exploring the world. The story takes place hundreds of years after the god of this world was killed. The hero called Arcor was wielding the Godslayer sword, and centuries later, one of his descendants used the power of that sword to rule the world. He was eventually defeated, and the Inquisition was formed to destroy any form of religion in the world. You play as Alita, who is an Inquisitor in training, but also another descendant of Arcor, capable of using the Godslayer sword. I was surprised with different dialogue options that you can select, which actually seem to matter. These decisions you make will affect how the story ends, but it also affects your standing with the Inquisition. So it's not just a linear story, although the storytelling itself is pretty basic in general. It's not a very interesting story, to be honest. It lacks memorable characters and maybe some plot twists. But it was enough for me to enjoy it and not get completely bored. The dialogue is very rough sometimes, but hey, it was their first game, give them a break.
How is that possible?
Although I had some problems with the storytelling in Shadows Awakening as well, mainly because it can get a bit confusing at times.
This is very confusing. You get used to it.
But overall, they vastly improved the storytelling and dialogue in general in Shadows Awakening. The story is told through a lot of scripted dialogue interactions, as well as these beautiful artistic slideshow cutscenes, I guess. Speaking of interesting things to see, the game has various locations that look unique, even though the exploration itself is not amazing by any means. This world map has a bunch of different areas that you'll unlock, which are connected with a loading screen. It reminds me of How to Be a God, another similar RPG I covered in the series.
You're a smart guy.
The size of all of these locations is pretty decent, but they still kinda feel linear to explore. The minimap can be very confusing or straight up broken. At first, it might seem like you can only explore within the gray zone, but you'll have plenty of situations where that's not the case. That's just a minor issue, I guess, although traversing some of these areas can be frustrating because of this. The second reason for some light frustrations are the controls. Look, let's get this straight, this is an old game, obviously. But whenever I'm trying to objectively criticize these game features, I'm also taking in consideration other games from similar time periods which did the same thing better or worse. Plenty of other similar isometric RPGs from the same time periods, or even older games for that matter, had better controls. First of all, moving around is not that bad, but instead of just clicking, you have to hold the left mouse button, otherwise your character will stutter a bit. Clicking on the enemy for attacks also feels very clumsy and stiff, with almost no proper feedback at all, it's weightless. Despite those issues, I could still kinda enjoy the gameplay, especially after your character gets a bit stronger. You will discover various attunements that you can use, which will essentially shape your builds. Most of them will give you some passive effects, and it's up to you to adjust that certain playstyle with the best items you can find, or buy. The game doesn't mess around when it comes to the difficulty, mainly because of how the healing works. You have hit points and blood points, which will gradually reduce each time you heal. And if you want to completely replenish the hit points and the blood points, you have to find a place to sleep. I think this made the game unnecessarily more frustrating in combat, especially because the combat itself looks like this. I obviously played as a melee character, and I know you can cast some spells, but the variety of builds seem very poor in general, especially because of the lack of unique abilities and spells. Enemies can either miss you a lot or two-shot you sometimes, but this also depends on your builds. Although it's pretty fun to put your character together with different attunements and gear, but the combat is just functional, it's not very fun to be honest. I recently did a video where I covered Larian RPGs, and I got to play Divine Divinity, which came out before Heretic Kingdoms. I also had some problems with the controls in that game, but it felt way better than this. You can also find some other examples of a better isometric combat from that time period, so don't think I'm just shitting on this game because it's old or something. Even so, I'm going to bet we're going to see that one guy in the comments who is butthurt because I even dare to criticize an old RPG that he likes. Yeah, fuck you too, dude. Anyway, I almost forgot to mention the most unique feature of the game, Dream World. With the press of a button, you're able to enter this second dimension where you can fight some unique monsters, solve some puzzles and quests, collect essence points for attunements, and so on. But Shadows Awakening also introduced a party-based system where you get to switch between 5 different characters of your choice. Anyway, the Dream World feels more like a gimmick, and the enemies you fight in that dimension lack the variety. It's a cool concept, but it's definitely underdeveloped in this game. Fortunately, the enemy variety in general is not that bad at all, but you always fight them in the same boring way, so it doesn't even matter a lot. It's a slapping contest if you're a melee character. I played the game on hard, and I regret that decision because it only makes the combat worse and longer. There is no way to change the difficulty, so be warned. Overall, I would actually recommend trying this game out if you can tolerate the clunky controls. If that's the case, you'll find a real hidden RPG gem to play when you're bored. There are plenty of worse ways to spend $5, let's just leave it at that. Number 2. Gladiator, Sword of Vengeance. Gladiator Sword of Vengeance is a hack-and-slash action-adventure released in 2003 on PlayStation 2, PC and Xbox. This is a very simple hack-and-slash game, and I did enjoy it quite a bit because of that. It's also not a very long game, so you can beat it in a couple of sittings. Sword of Vengeance looks like a PlayStation 2 game, because it is, but fortunately it's also on Steam, so you won't have a lot of problems to run it nowadays. Well, if you try to mess with the settings too much, you might have some issues because the game doesn't like that, apparently. I did manage to set it up on 4K and I didn't touch anything else because the game just freaks out and starts changing the resolution randomly. That was fun. I also had these black bars for a while until I switched to the beta version of the game, which seems to fix that issue. Long story short, just played the beta branch version of the game on Steam.
Very well.
Anyway, you play as a gladiator called Invictus Trax. The game doesn't try to waste your time, you're instantly thrown into action and you get to kill a bunch of gladiators in the tutorial. Literally everything the game teaches you here, which is about 3 different mechanics, is everything you need to know until the very end. Trax gets killed after the tutorial, but he gets resurrected. These kids are supposed to be Romulus and Remus, the founders of the Roman kingdom. Aruntius, the current leader of Rome, is a sadistic son of a bitch, basically. He managed to climb on the throne with the help of the black arts from the dark gods of terror. Trax has been selected by the gods to stop him. That's pretty much the main gist of the story.
Your work is just beginning, Invictus Thrax. You have been chosen.
You have a couple of different levels to beat until you get back to Rome and face Aruntius again. If you played at least one similar game from these time periods, you know exactly how this game plays. Like I said before, Sword of Vengeance has a very simple gameplay. You have 2 different attacks that you can combine, a dodge roll and special mechanic that you can activate that boosts your damage for a while. There are a couple of different weapons that you'll find when you progress through the game as well. These weapons feel a bit different and I was using a 2-handed axe a lot. However, the combat feels pretty much the same, no matter who you fight. There are only a handful of different enemy types, which force you to change your combat approach just a little bit. You know, instead of just mashing the button you have to roll a couple of times. But killing everyone else depends on how quick you mash your 2 attack buttons with an occasional dodge roll here and there. The controls are fine, so the gameplay feels okay as well, nothing outstanding though. You can definitely find a much better hack and slash game from this time period. For example, I recently covered Spartan Total Warrior, which did a much better job in general. However, I don't think this game is bad at all.
Thrax returns victorious? Perhaps, brother, the gods were right.
I mean, sure, your thumb is probably going to hurt a little bit after you're done, but you'll have some mindless fun that don't require much thinking. The boss fights are pretty disappointing though, because the game reuses one boss pretty much for the entire game. That didn't bother me that much like in some games. However, what did bother me a bit is the level design. Actually not the level design itself, but the checkpoint system. I was never a huge fan of this cheap checkpoint system that many games used to have back then. When you die, the game respawns you at the last checkpoint, which means you'll have to kill all the enemies again, but that's not the only problem. You will have to do these challenges and some very light puzzle work on pretty much all levels. When you die, you will have to repeat that again as well, which is really frustrating. It feels cheap, and the only reason why it exists is to prolong the game's length, I suppose. What makes the game more frustrating than it should be is the camera. This game has a completely static camera with some awful angles. It can easily make you confused sometimes, especially when you have to backtrack, which happens quite often actually. I mean, was it really that hard to include a normal camera in the game, because that would make the gameplay a lot less tedious. The only reason I could think for this design decision is to not have to render every single asset in 3D and save some resources on consoles. I don't know if that was the reason for this, but the camera can really suck in this game, and it's probably the biggest issue. Like I said, the game has these challenges that you have to do, and they're okay if you don't have to repeat them every time you die. The purpose of these challenges is usually to give you some damage or defense boost or increase your max HP. Overall, this is a very simple hack and slash action adventure, which can be fun for about 6 or 7 hours. It certainly lacks depth in terms of progression or customization. You won't find those features in this game, but if you don't have problems with that, I would recommend trying it out. Number 1. Knight's Contract. Knight's Contract is an action hack and slash game released in 2011 for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. I always thought this game looks pretty cool, but I never got the chance to try it out before. You can easily emulate this game with PS3 emulator nowadays, although the frame rate is stuck on 30 FPS. I used the upscaling option within the emulator to achieve 4K resolution, if you're wondering. This game received some pretty mediocre ratings when it came out, and after playing it myself, I can definitely see why. I think this game is my personal worst case of love-hate relationship that I ever experienced.
So, you've actually come.
Enough, I'm not here for sex.
There is a lot to love about this game, and you can even say it's very underrated in some regards. On the other side, it has a couple of very bad, or you can even say game-breaking mechanics. But let's talk about the positive stuff first.
It looks like talking isn't going to get us anywhere, is it?
I think this game looks very good in general, even today, especially if you can run it on 4K on your PC. The graphical fidelity is not exactly amazing, obviously, and you can find a lot of low-res textures here and there. But there are also a lot of cool visual details, like the snow effect on this level, or the whole lava theme on this particular level. There are also some very creative enemy designs, especially for bosses.
I could never forget you! I'll tear you apart, along with that traitorous witch! Ha! Is that so? You were far more violent than I was.
When it comes to combat, you can see some cool dismemberment effects, as well as some brutal looking finishing moves that you can pull off. Oh yeah, and some straight up bizarre visual effects, which I have to blur out, but still kinda cool.
What?
When it comes to the gameplay, Knight's Contract has a very decent action combat system with a good amount of challenge. You have a combo system with 2 different attack buttons that you can combine, a dodge mechanic, and different spells to use, which are provided by a witch follower. The gameplay can be described as a clunkier version of Darksiders 2, in a way. The controls are not exactly the snappiest, but they are not sluggish either. And if we could leave it at that, it would be an amazing game, right? Well, we have to talk about the bad stuff as well, and let's start with the worst one. I got 3 letters for you. QTE. Yeah, my arch enemy is back to torment me once again in one of these videos. If you're watching this series, you know I already covered several games which have some terrible QTE segments. Knight's Contract is hands down the worst when it comes to this, because QTEs in this game are unapologetic. Sometimes they don't even make any sense because I'm literally pressing the right button at the right time and somehow I still fail. My girlfriend seems to have more luck with QTEs, so she killed one of the bosses for me, by pure luck of course. I mean, we all know that women don't know how to play.
Do you wanna be single?
Anyway, to make things worse, the boss will heal up if you fail the segment, so you have to bring his health down again before you get another try with the QTE. I can't even stress enough how bad it feels in this game, up to the point where I won't even recommend trying this game out. Like I said, the game has a decent amount of challenging fights, which only makes failing QTE segments even worse. Which brings us to another very bad mechanic, but we have to mention the story first, in order for this to make any sense.
The Black Death. Just what I need.
Knight's Contract has a pretty unique setting. It's a fantasy medieval Germany setting with a fairly interesting story for an action game. You play as a knight called Henrik, who is cursed with immortality by a witch called Gretchen. Gretchen was slain by Henrik, and coincidentally, Gretchen becomes his companion after a century has passed from those events. Henrik actually killed the rest of the powerful witches, but they are back as hideous monsters. These witches are the main bosses in the game, and like I said before, they have a pretty unique visual design. I enjoy these fights quite a bit, if we exclude the awful QTEs and the second worst mechanic in the game related to Gretchen. You have to babysit her throughout the entire game, and not only that, but you have to pick her up quite often.
What?
Yeah, you literally pick up girls in this game. Well, a girl, but still. That probably sounds like a great mechanic, right? Well, no, because instead of thinking about your own health and the enemy you're fighting, you'll constantly have to worry about her getting killed like an idiot. Heinrich is immortal, so even when you die you have to press X until your thumb bleeds before you resurrect again, and by the time you do it, Gretchen is usually very much dead.
How is that possible?
Picking her up will slowly regenerate her health, which is very cute. That was sarcasm, by the way.
Enough.
The spells you can cast in combat are actually coming from Gretchen. You can cast these spells even when Heinrich is down, although that's not very helpful. These spells are essential for killing even the most basic enemies. When you get their health down a little bit, you'll be able to execute most of them with a spell, plus another less tedious QTE you have to do. I think her spells are very cool and impactful, but sometimes the game can look like a pixel soup. The effects are a little bit over the top, which can make it hard to see what the f is going on. The camera can make things even worse, especially when the game insists on using a static camera angle in some random segments. It also doesn't help that you have to keep holding the lock-on button in most situations and at the same time press 2 buttons for casting a spell. This feels harder than it should be because you're essentially pressing 3 buttons at once every time you want to cast a spell. Even though the game is pretty linear, you can still somehow get lost and go in circles on these levels, which can be very annoying. The level design is not the best, especially in those moments, but it's only a minor issue compared to what I just talked about. The action combat can be extremely enjoyable when you get the hang of it. I'm really pissed off because this could easily be an amazing action game if not for those issues. Sadly, I can't recommend playing this game today because most people will probably get really mad and rage quit, and I don't blame them.
Don't be a fool.
And that would be it for the 8th episode of Hidden Gems or Trash.
Finally.
Tell me which game looks the best to you and did you play any of them before? Leave a comment down below. If you like the video, please consider supporting the channel by subscribing and liking the video, it really means a lot. Tell me, did you play any of these games and which one is your favorite and why? I'll have GOG links for some of these games, and if you want to buy them, you can support the channel by using my links. Speaking of supporting the channel, I just launched my personal store where you can buy some interesting t-shirts and hoodies. Check out some cool designs in the theme of the channel, like this RPG Zone hoodie or Nameless Hero t-shirt. But you'll find a lot more if you follow the link in the description. I think that's a great way to get something back for supporting the channel. And of course, you can always become a Patreon or a YouTube member and get your name on the end credits of my videos. Many thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.